Hey, Grateful Parents. I'm here with my friend Marcus, and we did a video a couple weeks ago over grief, and got a lot of feedback on that, and just wanted to have another conversation in this midst of quarantine. Now we're slightly starting to come out of things. I had someone tell me yesterday it was kind of like prison, but now we're in the courtyard, so we're getting a little bit closer, more out into the open, and so things are starting to open up here. You told me that you got your first haircut.
I know. I'm so excited. Praise be to Jesus. On my birthday, even.
Wow.
I know. It was the first day they were open, because mid-May now, and I'd gone almost 12 weeks, which is a record for me in at least a decade. So
that's awesome.
It's the simple things. First world problems, right?
Yeah.
But I was glad, and figuring out how to, this week, I had both a haircut and a massage. How do you do those with face masks, right? Because that's a requirement, and so that was a whole different thing, and I was the guinea pig, I think, in both cases. So, and that's okay with me. That's kind of how I roll. And I spoke to a group today, live for the first time since quarantine, and how does that work? And so we're just figuring out all these new normals. I have a small church that is under the 25, and I preached their first service back. Yeah. And just what a different thing, what a different experience, and almost just kind of the need to kind of reflect and frame all of it. Right. And I never thought I would leave a massage going, I need to think about this. Right.
I'm feeling you on the haircut. I haven't gotten a haircut in
hence the hat.
Yeah, 7+ weeks. And so Jared, shout out, is gonna cut my hair Monday, so I'm really excited about that. But yeah, we talked about grief last time, and this idea of, how do I parent in all of this? How do I move forward? And so we're going to kind of talk about kind of feeling overwhelmed and maybe guilty. Yeah, is that the right word?
Yeah, I think so.
Feeling guilty about not doing enough or doing too much. Should I let my kid go to the coffee shop? Should I let my kid go hang out with friends? Like this tension of there's so much unknown. What do I do in the midst of all of this? And so hopefully we can have a helpful conversation of what does it mean? How do we parent? How do we move forward even as leaders in the midst of all that?
Right. And what do we do when our kids are feeling overwhelmed? And all of this is, bigger than COVID or a pandemic, right? It just brings more of it to the surface. There's, we're stuck together. There's more kind of tension. There's more anxiety. My daughter turned 13 Saturday, and we're still kind of keeping the restrictions because we're just a little nervous about, everyone rushing out. And, being a 13-year-old girl's hard enough, trying to figure out the birthday thing and all of that stuff. And honestly, I think that I'm just continually reminded, especially in this season, that parenting is the hardest thing I do. It's the greatest thing I get to do, outside of following Jesus. And sometimes I think following Jesus is easier than parenting, if I'm honest. Yeah. That there's certain times in this season that it's the tension of parenting where there's this deep joy and tremendous burden. And I think, like all parents, I'm always worrying that I'm, screwing up my kid. Yeah. Right? Now, some parents have told me that that's like part of the fun, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's true, right? Maybe in fun ways, like screwing up our kids, and I guess we all do. My parents were good parents, but hey, I got messed up a little bit by my family. Sure. And I don't think any of that's intentional, but I think we worry about that. Somebody once told me that every family has dysfunction. Yeah. So does your family put the fun in dysfunction, or do they take the fun out of dysfunction? Yeah. And so in our house, we've kind of got an idea between my wife's family and mine. We've got one of each. We don't announce publicly, on YouTube who that might be. Right. Yeah. And that is a good idea.
And last time we were doing this over Zoom. Right. And I've realized even myself feeling overwhelmed when everything seems to take 4 times longer. When you gotta set up the Zoom call, you gotta make sure your internet's good, everyone's freezing, and you're trying to have those conversations. And so I think there's so much that's being piled onto us that we may not actually know the root of what is overwhelming us. And so I think sometimes just naming it, which we talked about last time, just naming what you're grieving, name what's maybe overwhelming you, can be helpful too.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anyone that's not been overwhelmed in this season.
Right.
Not just here, right? Not just in Northeast Indiana. I mean, I've talked to people around the world, from Bangladesh to India to Kenya to California, right? Mm-hmm. That everyone has felt some sense of being overwhelmed, and parents especially, because we're all being asked to do things that aren't our natural ability, right? So, instead of just being parents, we're now also educators. We're now also like chefs, right? There's a part of us that's got to kind of be, medical doctors in some way, right? Trying to explain some of this to our kids as we're trying to wrap our heads around it. And of course, everybody's become an expert all of a sudden. So,
right. But also people are trying to run businesses, or they're trying to do their normal job and tasks on top of everything else. And so it's so much harder. Plus, there's this, if you're a believer, you're trying to figure out too, like, how do I make sure that the spiritual temperature of my kid is doing well? Like, they haven't been to youth group, they haven't, like, there's all this content online, but how do I make sure that they're connecting to God too? And so I feel like there's even that pressure on parents in that way too, that there's so much noise. What do I listen to? How do I navigate? That I think for some people, they either run forward, they freeze, they're just not sure what to do. And so I think the reaction can be all across the board there too. Right,
and it's even harder to monitor some of that stuff. Even though like you're trapped together, I think it can be harder to monitor some of that stuff. And our kids need they need the technology, and they need the screen time more now. I heard one parent say, "Hey, right now taking my daughter's phone away is like locking her in a closet, because that's her only ability to socially connect." And I don't know what I think about that, but there's a part of me that's like, wait a minute, this is more complicated for sure. And I think, again, when you're trapped together, and you're all feeling overwhelmed and you're all experiencing anxiety, it's just so much easier to be tense with each other, right? It's like that. It's like we're in a perpetual car ride. We're in a perpetual car trip, basically.
Yeah.
Parents are getting irritated with each other, and kids are getting irritated with each other, and we're trying to figure it out. And I think being overwhelmed is natural, and it's not. We assume it's a sign of weakness, and I think that's a mistake, because at the end of the day, I think being overwhelmed is just a reminder that we're human.
Sure.
And that it's okay. There's just nobody that's not got overwhelmed. This is overwhelming.
Yeah. So parents are overwhelmed, but how do we move to that part where you're saying parents, they may start to feel guilt? Like what's kind of the bridge, what's kind of the gap that would kind of move over there? So we understand there's people that are overwhelmed. Now talk maybe about the guilt part.
Yeah, I think everything in parenting feels personal. Our kids' successes and failures feel really, really personal. One of the best ways probably to frame this is to share a story. I used to I probably shouldn't have done this as a pastor, but I used to play a game in my one church called See Which Family is Still Fighting before church.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know if I've shared this, but so there was a window, right? And you could see in the parking lot again, the family that hadn't finished their fight in the car parked further away so they could finish their fight on the way in, and those that had finished the fight parked closer. They come in and have it perfect together. And I think when we look at, a counselor once said to me, comparison is the basis of all unhappiness. And I hate blanket statements, and so as an 8, I just want to find the exception, right? I'm constantly, this was a decade ago, right? More than a decade ago. I'm still looking for the exception. And so I think when things don't go well, we feel like we failed. And when we feel like we failed, we feel really guilty. And guilt and shame, they're not of God. That's different than remorse and repentance, right? That and this is a really important distinction, that guilt and shame say that we're defined by our shortcomings, we're defined by our weaknesses, we're defined by our sin, that our identity is where we've fallen short. And I think in American society, and even in the American church, we spend way too much time looking at what's not right, what's not good, what's fallen short, than what is good and what is right. And I think when we, every cycle of addiction, guilt and shame is at the center of it. If it's not purely a chemical one, guilt and shame is a part of it. And so I think what happens is when we fail, or when we overreact, or when we lash out or yell at our kid or respond in a way that we wouldn't want to, we feel it's just natural to feel guilty. But the reality is, again, the best baseball players hit it 4 out of 10 times.
Right.
You know, I've got teenagers. I travel the world to speak about adolescence. I'm not hitting 9 out of 10.
Right.
I'm not hitting 10 out of 10, right?
So let me ask the $1 million question. You said guilt and shame is not from God, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean those feelings aren't going to creep in.
Right.
So what do I do with guilt and shame? If a parent's listening to this and that's all creeping in, obviously we have different makeup with personalities and backgrounds and all that stuff. But like when that's creeping in, blanket statement, what do I begin to do?
Yeah, great question. I'm very prone to it for me because insecurity is kind of one of my hang-ups and a hard German, rigid environment, right? Sure. I think first we've got to recognize that we follow a God of grace, right? The best, what happens is, and that our identity, again, is not in these things. Keep in mind that Jesus ran away from his own parents, and they got annoyed, right? And he's like, what are you upset about? Yeah. Of course I'm in the temple. Yeah. I think of the story of Jesus' baptism. When I think about guilt and shame, I think that kind of the antidote, if you will, the blanket antidote of this is to think of the story of Jesus' baptism, right? And I just can't imagine like what John is going through.
Sure, right.
You don't want to hold Jesus underwater too long, right? I mean, and so there's this moment, the voice from heaven, this is my son, my beloved, with whom I'm well pleased. And I think we kind of gloss over those words. And we assume that that's just, hey, God's just telling us that Jesus is the Son of God, and that's great. There's more. That's our identity as children of God.
Right.
That you and I, that Marcus, that Kevin, that Steve, that Susie, that Abby, that Jessica, that even in like our darkest moment, even in our worst failures, we are God's son and daughter. His beloved, with whom he is well pleased. I think of the image of adoption, right? That in adoption you say, I'm going to accept you into my family as you are and love you as my own. That's what God does with us, in our salvation, in our baptism. God invites us to just be a part of his family, his children, just as we are, right? Just as we are. And there's nobody in this world that can perfectly love us in the midst of our good days, our bad days, being hangry, making mistakes, sinning, lashing out, snapping at our kids, like God can.
Yeah.
And so for me, when I'm in a guilt and shame mode, first I have people I go to and say, hey, I'm feeling guilt about this. Speak the truth to me. I'm feeling insecure about this. Speak the truth to me. I mishandled this. I apologize. Apologizing to your kids is great. It's really healthy. But, I have somebody speak truth to me. But then I also go back to that story, right? That this is the beginning of Jesus's ministry. And it all centers on his identity. God's son, his beloved, with whom he's well pleased. And what I have to say over and over again is that's my identity too.
Right.
That's your identity too.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point. And a friend told me this. I'm trying to get a habit of doing this. Is every day, and the end of every day, is to remind myself who I am and who God is. Mm-hmm. If you can start your day every day, say this is who God is, and this is who I am in Christ. I think that starts the day on a totally different path, and end the day on a totally different path. And you can begin to regulate, hey, where did that guilt come from? Where did that word or that lie come from? And you begin to pinpoint it. Or it's like, well, that's not that big a deal, actually. In the light of eternity, it's not that big a deal.
Right.
And so I think recalibrating ourselves and figuring out where our identity lies is super, super important.
Yeah, and it's not to say you shouldn't have remorse for when you make a mistake.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Or you shouldn't repent, which means to turn around, right? We are people who confess those sins, who confess, those shortcomings, but we're not supposed to dwell in it.
Right.
I was asked recently by a group of people I'm working with, they said, name a time where you had a conflict and how you handled it. And I couldn't. And I was really frustrated with that at first. And I realized the reason I couldn't is because I had finally started to learn to let go of things after I let go of things. Mm. And I think what happens, guilt is that initial feeling. And when you hold on to it, when you don't let go and then let go again, that's where the guilt and shame kind of creep in, that we believe that Satan is the author of lies, right? Steal, kill, and destroy. that this is where Satan kind of whispers into us, right? The evil one whispers into us that, and the world tells us that we are our shortcomings, we are our mistakes, we are our performance. Yet we have this voice from heaven.
Sure.
Jesus hadn't done anything good yet.
Right.
No walking on water, no healings, no preaching, right? Just showed up.
Yeah.
My son, my beloved. And that's our identity.
So you talked about letting go then letting go. Can you maybe kind of distinguish between the two of what does it mean to let go and then let go?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times, so I am really hard on myself, right? I'm a high functioning, driven guy, again, part of being an 8 on the Enneagram, right? And I'm my own worst critic, always and forever. And I think, and maybe it was one time I was praying years ago, I got this image of a baseball bat, right? And I think guilt and shame that not letting go is when, you have a baseball bat and you just, every once in a while, kind of keep hitting yourself, right? That it's, you got to drop the bat. Like after you hit the ball, you drop the bat. I'm not a baseball expert, but it seems to me every time.
It makes more sense not to run around the bases with
right.
the bat. Yeah.
And I think what we do is we just carry the bat around. And anytime we make a mistake or anytime we're reminded of a mistake we've been, we take another whack. And so, I mean, you've got to let go. Say, I'm going to name it. That's the first letting go, right? I'm going to name it.
Sure.
And whether that involves confession, apology, or both, fine. But then to really let it go, to say, this is not going to shape my identity. If I've learned from this, it's over, right? It's over. And I think we struggle to do that. It's hard to make grace personal. Like, I can show you grace way easier than I can show myself grace.
Right, sure, yeah.
Right? And I think that's especially true as parents because there's so much at stake. We've got these little children that we're entrusted with, and we want to be better. Even if we've had the best parents in the world, we want to be better parents than we've had. And so what happens, I think, is when we fail, when we feel like we've screwed our kids up forever, and I felt that way more than once, we just we hang on to that instead of saying, all right, moving on. I'm not going to do that again, or I'm not going to make that mistake again. And I have a friend that, has talked about that struggle, that I don't ever want to hurt my children. And it's like, well, you're not purposely hurting your children.
Right, yeah.
And your children are going to get hurt by other people. So if they can see you apologize, they learn to apologize. If they can see you let go, they learn to let go. But again, we've got a spiritual force in a world telling us that we're nothing more than our mistakes, we're nothing more than our sins, we're nothing more than our shortcomings.
So we feel overwhelmed, we feel guilt, and so let's kind of pivot and move back to where we were kind of starting. What happens when our kids start to feel overwhelmed? What direction do we start going there?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I said this last time that, the worst experience we can have is when our kids are hurting and we can't fix it. For me, that's even more profound with my daughter. It's like a dad-daughter thing. Yeah. I feel like every dad should have a daughter, but probably not more than one. I'm just saying, my daughter's 13, so I mean, I think first we got to recognize that it's natural for kids to feel overwhelmed, and it's not a reflection on us. And even if it is, so what? We've got to help them get through it, just like we want to get through it. With babies, crying is the only way they can express themselves, right? For kids, younger kids, maybe it's, a tantrum or anger, right? When my daughter was 3 and was potty training, I used to not set an alarm when she was potty trained because I could wake up every morning to her and my wife arguing, I'm not going to go potty, I'm not going to go potty. Yeah. And one morning I heard this noise and I knew something was wrong, so I jumped out of bed. And my daughter at 3 hit spit in my wife's face and slapped her.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. She almost met Jesus that day. So I was, yeah. So we just, kids have that. And so I think the first thing is just recognizing it's normal. I think the second thing is having empathy. How are they feeling? One of the things that sometimes when I'm not in my finest parenting moment is I try to gloss over my kids' emotions because I feel bad that I can't fix it. But when I'm doing what I know is right, I'm having empathy for that.
Can we pause there for a second? Because I think that's really important, having empathy for other people. But I think the only way you can have empathy for someone else is if you're healthy, right?
Yeah.
So if you're feeling overwhelmed and you're not taking care of all that buildup, you're not going to be able to take care of your spouse or your kids.
Right.
And so I love that that's your second point, but this is where the first part of this podcast is really important because if you're feeling overwhelmed and you're not taking care of that, there's no way you're going to have any energy left to have empathy, right?
Right. It's the analogy of, put your mask on in the airplane before somebody else. Every time I hear it, I'm going, no, I won't do that. Yeah. But I know I'm supposed to do that.
Right.
And I will. Yeah. If it ever came to that, I would. But yeah, you can't give what you don't have. And as a parent, you will run out without letting Jesus pour into you, right? I have this, it's you anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows, and I have this painting in my office. And it's literally a cup of oil pouring over this, man's head. Thankfully he's bald, so it's okay. And it fills into this cup that then overflows out onto this image of all these other people. That we can't pour out what we don't have. And so we've got to allow God and others to pour into us. We've got to do the best to be healthy and then help our kids. Put our mask on, then help our kids. And yeah, I think that, and sometimes empathy is, after the fact, right? That there are plenty of times that I've responded to my kids being overwhelmed in a way that wasn't best, and I had time to reflect, sometimes with like the glaring nudge of my wife. To reflect and just say, hey, I just need to apologize earlier. I was stressed, and that's not an excuse, but that's what was happening. So again, they know that sometimes they're reacting out of stress, but that's not, you still need to apologize, not excuse. And I'm sorry that I did that. And again, that's hard, but boy, it gets easier over time. And I think even when you can't have empathy, even just giving the space to express it and say this is normal and this is okay, is really a gift. It's really a gift. I mean, when I'm struggling, just having somebody who says genuinely, hey, I've been there, or hey, this seems normal, hey, this is understandable. Because when we're in the muck, and the mire, we don't feel like it's normal and natural. Nothing feels normal, natural, healthy about it. And so I think that even if you're struggling to have empathy, even if you can just start with space. Because sometimes as a parent, you can only just muster so much.
Right, sure.
Right? There's just,
Especially when you're teacher, chef, all those things that you were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, you're the housekeeper, you're still working, you're still...
Yeah, and off camera I was saying, hey, what else are you doing today? And you said, I'm going to prioritize mowing and going on a walk. And so taking things where you prioritize yourself and say, okay, my walk, I'm going to clear my head or whatever that is, I think that's good.
Yeah, and it's a modeling thing, right? So we, one of the things we do when our kids feel overwhelmed is we show them our coping mechanisms and help them find their own.
Sure.
And so in this pandemic, walking has been it for me. When the hormone land just gets too dense, and when I can feel myself responding out of my own issues or just responding out of being annoyed.
Sure.
I'm on the walk right away. I tag out, and take that walk. And with our own kids, we've had counselors and friends and mentors, and even ourselves kind of help them developing, their coping mechanisms. So maybe it's my daughter taking the dogs out, or I know she's having a really bad day when she starts baking, right? That's one of her coping mechanisms. But my son needs to distance. He's an introvert and more reserved, so he's got to kind of distance. But he has literally learned to say, I'm overwhelmed, just no words. I need space.
Yeah.
And to even say chemistry. I said today, how's your e-learning? He said, good, but I'm overwhelmed with chemistry and it can wait. And I said, good decision.
Yeah.
Now there's a part of me wanted to say, suck it up, Buttercup, and get the chemistry done.
Right.
But there's the other part of me is like, this is victory, right? Like this is where we're at.
Which it kind of goes back to what you talked about last time about guardrails too. Mm-hmm. Like there's those built-in things where you allow them to kind of make their own decisions, even if you're like, suck it up, right? Just go ahead and do it. There's guardrails of saying, it's okay. Like I'm going to let you drive a little bit and see how this all kind of pans out, right?
I think it's easier for dads, though, if I'm honest.
Sure.
There's just something about carrying a baby and being a mom. I think that makes it different. So that's a unique dynamic worth mentioning in our house that, with my wife, I've just, we've had to kind of figure that out. Say, hey, I know you mean well, this is overwhelming. And particularly with my son, when she kind of gets plays the 5,000 question game.
Yeah.
And I can just see his, anxiety, and I can just see him ready to react. And I know both of their intentions to say, hey, I think this is too much right now.
Yeah.
And to be able to step aside and say, I'm not trying to, hinder anything, but I think, this is where he gets overwhelmed. Right. And she's like, it's just hard not knowing, right?
Yeah.
The letting go, because ours are teenage age, so we're starting that
right,
kind of that process of letting go after, they trick you, you fall in love with them, and then they, it's like Gremlins. If you ever seen the movie Gremlins, right?
Yeah.
They're really cute until you spill water on them,
right,
or feed them after midnight. That's pretty much teenagers
right. Yes.
in a nutshell. Yeah. And so
the good thing about being the youth pastor or family pastor is I get to spend a short amount of time with them, and then I send them home.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you'll get yours one way or another.
Yeah.
And for parents that, I'm not in a hurry for this, but someday grandparents, you get to have that.
Yeah.
Because
you sugar them up, and then you just release them. Yeah.
Or just watch the genetics at play. Like, I'll call my mom and be like, hey, I got a funny story to tell you, but first, let me apologize.
Yeah.
Because genetics are just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Especially in quarantine, you start to see them.
Right.
So the things that I get mad at my kids for, I'm like, that is just me.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm honest.
Yeah.
I'm not always honest.
Right. So week 10 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
All this,
week 132.
Right. That's what it feels like. And a parent's made it this far in the podcast. What would you begin to tell them about guilt, about feeling overwhelmed? As we kind of wrap this thing up, like, what would your encouragement be wherever they're at in the season of parenting, or if it's a small group leader listening? How would you encourage them to kind of move forward? Like, how do we take it from head to heart and kind of move out and move it forward?
I mean, I think the first thing is keep pushing forward. Mm-hmm. That it's going to be okay. Mm-hmm. And no matter how restrictions are eased or how this goes, we are going to survive this.
Yeah.
I think just reminding that there's plenty of hope. I think the second thing is just to continue to go to Jesus and to point your kids to Jesus over and over again. And the more that they see you go to Jesus with your moments of being overwhelmed and guilty and struggle, the more likely they are to go to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And there's times where there's things in life I can't handle in the moment, maybe even for a day or a week, right? And yet there's nothing that Jesus can't handle. And so I think the best parenting comes when we model. And so I think modeling that and just recognizing that we're not in this alone. Besides your spouse, if you're in that situation, besides, your church or whatever, besides Jesus, not to set that aside, that there's just this whole group of people that your kid has a connection with. One of the things I learned in my doctoral research is it really takes 5 healthy invested adults in addition to 2 parents, to create a healthy Christ-following kid.
Yeah, give them the best shot.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So leverage those folks, right? Lean on your small group leaders. Lean on your neighbors that your kids feel good about. We have a friend that lives kind of down the country block, if you will, and so, he came over to pick up, some honey, and so, he intentionally went and checked in on Micah, and that was good. Abby was having a hard time with her 13th birthday, so I called, one of her 5 and said, hey, Abby's having a struggle with this, so could you just make the time, if you didn't know, Saturday's her birthday. Yeah. And sure enough, right? And so leveraging those connections, because we were never meant to do it alone. It's not a cliche that it takes a village. I would argue it takes Christ's village.
Yeah.
And so leveraging that village. And I think don't be afraid to ask for help. The truth is that what you're experiencing in your home right now is way more normal than you realize. And the neighbor friend who's afraid to talk about is experiencing the same thing or perhaps even worse.
Yeah.
And so, lean into, don't be afraid to ask for help, whether it comes, from you or Brennan or Pastor C or from, extended family or small group members or neighbors. Don't be afraid to ask for help. You shouldn't feel guilty about that, because if the roles were reversed, right? And that's I'm terrible at asking for help. So I, there's a little bit of hypocrisy.
Sure.
In this. But that's one of the things I've learned in this season is that I just need to feel more comfortable asking for help.
Pride aside.
Right. Well, and it's sometimes it's just you don't want to bother people.
Right, sure.
Right? You don't want to bother
They're
people.
really they're overwhelmed too, but no, you're not.
Yeah.
You need other people.
Well, and again, if the roles were reversed, I would be upset if I knew they didn't ask me.
Sure.
And so sometimes I just got to smack myself a little
Yeah.
bit with that. But again, I think it's just pointing ourselves, pointing our kids to Jesus over and over again. That's where we get our peace from. There's no circumstance, there's no trick, there's no amount of parental training that's going to make you be able to do this, batting 1,000%, and feel peace about it all the time. There's no instruction book that's going to last more than 30 seconds. You know?
Yeah.
I mean,
I saw a book today on Amazon. It was like how to navigate, the coronavirus, and I'm like, if I bought that book and it came, it would be outdated by the time I could get it in my hands. So there's no real, there's not a guideline for any of this really.
No, and not to insult whoever wrote that, but they're a liar.
Right.
There's just there's no way. There's no way.
Yeah.
Even as I work with people in this, whether it's leaders or parents, I say, hey, here's a couple things we know. Here's a couple things we're experiencing because this is foreign.
Yeah.
This is so different.
But it's normal. Like at the same time, like
right.
everyone.
What you're feeling is normal.
Right.
The experience isn't normal.
Right. Yeah.
But what you're feeling in light of the experience is normal.
Yeah.
It is. And again, I mean, I said good morning to my daughter today, and you would have thought I shot the cat.
Right.
It's just, she's 13 and she's a girl, and it is what it is. Yeah. And so, I just had to, and nobody in my house is a morning person except for me. So there's some tension. Yeah, I think it's again creating space to just let it be expressed. And even if it's expressed in a less than ideal way, wait to follow up. Having empathy and just, again, going to and pointing your kids to Jesus. And you know what? It's not going to be perfect. You're not going to nail it, but you're going to survive it, and you'll grow. I mean, I've grown more in my faith from being a parent than anything else I've done.
Well, thank you so much, Marcus. I think even for my own life, got some nuggets out of this of how I can navigate in ministry, even in my marriage and things like that. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I just love this time together and in person.
Right.
It's
in
wonderful.
person is great to actually have human interaction. I'd say if anyone's listening to this and this was helpful, I'd love for you just to reach out and let us know how we can better serve you moving forward. But thanks again, Marcus. I always enjoy our conversations and our friendship.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there, like you said, if there are other things that, hey, you're struggling with, we're glad to kind of wrestle with them. We may not have all the answers, but we can find our way through how we do it together.
Sure.
And do it together with Jesus.
Yep. So thanks for listening. Take care.